Great. Okay. So good evening, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our fourth session of SMART training. And we'd like to welcome you back for another session. In the first, I just want to recap what the first few sessions have been about. So on our first session, which was 3 weeks ago now, seems like a long time already, the beginning of March, on the 4th of March, we presented our first training, which was about the overview of SMART and the tools in the SMART toolbox. And we provided some case studies on how SMART is being used in different parts of the snow leopard's range. And in the second session, we had a look at how you set up SMART from scratch and what are the things that you need to do to get ready for SMART, to prepare for SMART, and then to launch SMART and make it sustainable. In the third session, we learned about how to collect data. We learned about the tools for collecting data in the field, SMART Mobile and SMART Collect, and we had a demonstration of how that is being done at one of our sites in Mongolia. And in our fourth session today, we're going to learn about how we can use the SMART tool to design surveys and to collect data and to then manage that data and export it in a way that can be analyzed. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Samantha Strindberg, who is our senior wildlife statistician. And Samantha works for the Global Conservation Program of the Wildlife Conservation Society. And today she's going to present a virtual introduction to SMART ecological records. So I'd like to hand over to Sam to take it forward.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks to the Snow Leopard Network for inviting me to give this training session. I'm very, very happy to be here with you. So what I would like to do, if my slides change, is to hopefully provide you with a brief introduction to SMART-ER and also place this sort of technological innovation within the context of ecological monitoring, the selection of an appropriate survey method, as well as survey design and analysis of the resulting data. And I'll show you some examples from our Ndoki-Lekwala landscape in northeastern Republic of Congo as I go along. So in a nutshell, SMART Ecological Records is a plugin that can be installed as part of the SMART system to help with the collection and management of ecological data. And SMART-ER mimics the hierarchical framework used for SMART patrol data, and we'll look at the various elements in more detail in a moment. Basically, once you install SMART-ER, a new survey menu with a number of options, which we'll look at, become available. But before we get into some of these details, it might be useful to cover a couple of definitions just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Firstly, for our purposes here, when we talk about a survey, we mean the collection of a sample of observation-based field data. Generally, we mean human-based observations rather than photo, video, or other digital data. And the target of these surveys could be any of a large variety of animals, their sign, plants, habitat, or human-related features. And the surveys themselves could be completed in a variety of habitats, either on foot or using various modes of transport. And the survey method you use will depend on your target species and your particular monitoring question, of course. So for snow leopards, in particular, you might be interested in monitoring the animals themselves or their prey and habitat. And I thought this figure from the Singh and Milner-Gillen paper very nicely illustrated how the survey methods and modes of operation change as a function of the habitat features. And remember that we're not focusing on the camera trap option shown in this figure. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, in terms of somewhat reduced human pressure, snow leopards and their prey occupy the difficult terrain and tend to be found in remote and large geographic areas, which makes these surveys challenging. But I'm pretty sure that I don't need to tell you that. So luckily, you have a very nice comprehensive manual to guide you through the application of one of the key methods for monitoring snow leopard prey, namely double observer methods. And this method relies on a mark recapture type of analysis using data from independent observers. And here the trick is to ensure that the independent observers cover the same areas and that one is able to correctly figure out which animals are recited. And a possibility is to maybe take distance measurements and compass bearings to help figure out what's been seen and where things overlap. And this might also make it possible to move this to the realm of spatial capture recapture, which has the added advantage of being able to deal with spatial heterogeneity and avoids the need for sort of ad hoc decisions when you're trying to figure out the area of your sampling region, when you try and move from an abundance estimate to an estimate of density. Another method that could be useful over larger areas where maybe you don't have the resources to do camera trapping or to do the targeted prey monitoring is something like occupancy surveys. And they're based on detection, non-detection data, possibly just of indirect sign or even through questionnaire surveys of members from the communities living in the area of interest. And depending on the size of the grid cells or however you decide to define the sampling unit, you'll end up with a probability of occupancy or use. And the method accounts for detectability, as do all the other methods I've mentioned here and will mention, which is really important for robust monitoring in time and space. And another thing to mention is that you need enough sampling units for each of these methods to be able to detect trends. And when it comes to snow leopards and their prey, something like strip transects or plots will likely be of more limited use, perhaps for dung surveys of the prey species or habitat studies. And although a method like distance sampling along either lines or at points has been used extensively in wildlife assessments, applying this method to snow leopard prey or its habitat will only work in certain circumstances. Generally, line transects are more efficient than point transects, but in very rugged environments, it makes sense to use point transects. And we found that, for example, with our work on the Tibetan Plateau. And if you do end up using distance sampling, of course, great care needs to be taken to get accurate distance measurements and group sizes for the target species. So whichever method you end up using, it's always worth applying a random survey design, as then you are on a more solid footing to draw conclusions about your entire study area. As you work on your study design, there'll almost always be a tension between the perfect design that gives you great precision and that will allow you to detect trends and the available resources and logistical constraints. It really is requires a careful balancing act. So in terms of our survey, we want to be sure that it allows us to assess whether or not, for example, threats such as, in this example, unsustainable or illegal hunting are decreasing and or wildlife populations are increasing. So monitoring helps us test our assumptions. Are our interventions actually leading to what we want to achieve, or are they just wasted effort? So in this example from Congo, does law enforcement or conservation education for children change the level of poaching, and does this result in an increase in forest elephants? Successful monitoring is much more than counting plants and animals over time. Its success requires that it be placed within the context of a management framework so that we can determine if the interventions work and what should be changed if monitoring reveals that things are not going to plan. And this applies to both the ecological monitoring that we're talking about here and the law enforcement monitoring that you discussed earlier. And the thing we ideally want to avoid is inconclusive monitoring results where we're not sure what our management response should be. So given this backdrop, let's take a look at SmartER in a bit more detail now through the experiences applying the technology to our Ndoki-Lekala landscape in the Republic of Congo. Here the conservation targets include forest elephants, great apes, such as western lowland gorillas and central chimpanzees, African grey parrots, and a variety of ungulates. And so we've done a series of landscape-wide surveys to assess changes in those target wildlife populations over time. And during the last round of surveys in 2016-17, SmartER was used. The project lead was Terry Brunchek, and as you can see, her extensive design involves a huge amount of survey effort across an enormous area that includes Nobali and Ndoki National Park and the Lactalia Community Reserve in dark green, several logging concessions in lighter green, a swampy area in light blue, and an area of particular interest for great apes, dwarf crocodiles, and others enjoying the swamp called Batanga to the southeast of Lactalia Community Reserve. So this survey design that Terry developed maps onto what is also referred to as a survey design within SmartER pretty seamlessly, in that it's a template for survey data collection. Within SmartER, as we'll see in a moment, one also defines a number of elements related to the survey design, namely the survey properties, mission properties, and the sampling unit definition. There are no data associated with the survey design. But associated with the survey design within SmartER are the surveys where the observational data are collected by visiting all the sampling units at least once. So one or more missions are associated with each survey, which is basically a single complete set of survey data. During the missions themselves, survey teams go to the field to collect the survey data. And one thing you need to do as an initial first step is to define survey observation categories and attributes. And this can either be done in the existing conservation area data model, basically the model underlying your sort of smart system, or defined as part of a configurable data model. And you don't need to have a configurable data model, but it can speed things up in terms of data entry and retrieval. And it can also be associated with more than one survey design. And another thing that needs to be defined at the global level when you're setting things up are the mission properties. And you would do this by selecting it from the survey menu. And you add properties until you have everything you want in terms of your particular mission. So for example, maybe you want to define the survey season and a sector property that would be associated with each mission so that you know whether the mission was completed in the dry, short wet, or long wet season, and in which sector of your conservation area took place. So once you define the mission properties, they'll be available for selection later on, as we'll see in a moment. And the next thing that needs to be set up globally are the sampling unit attributes, which is again done by selecting that item off the survey menu And the process is pretty much the same as defining data model attributes, which I think Tony showed you a little bit of during an earlier training session. And again, as for the mission properties, you would define sampling unit attributes that make sense for the particular sampling units you plan to have in your survey. So maybe you want to know what habitat sampling unit is associated with, or different type of measurements to water or human settlements. There's a whole universe of options here. So once you have those three elements in place, namely the observation categories and attributes you need within your data model, the mission properties, and the sampling unit attributes, then you can take the big leap of creating a new survey design. And here there are a couple of initial options that include selecting whether or not to record some additional information for each observation, namely the distance and direction and observer. And next you'd need to select your data model. Then you select all or a subset of those mission properties that you defined previously. And you can also specify some survey properties. So for example, maybe you're conducting a line transect vegetation survey with 60 sampling units of 400 meters each. And you could enter that under the survey properties. And you would select all or a subset again of the sampling unit attributes you defined earlier, and then import the actual sampling units themselves, either from a shapefile, or you can also enter them from a text file that you've defined outside of the smart system. So for the Ndoki-Likwala landscape survey, we had 2-kilometer transects in a systematic design with a random start, and the design was created using the distance software. And this software saves the design in a shapefile, which can then be imported into SmartER. So once you select import survey designs, you can tell SmartER where to find your new survey design. And once that's in place, you can then use it as a basis for defining your surveys. So first you would then give the new survey a name and define survey date ranges. And finally, once you define the set of one or more missions associated with the survey, again, giving each a name and a date range that fall within the survey dates you defined earlier. And once you've done all that, and selected, and as you set up the missions themselves, part of creating that involves actually telling SmartER who the team members will be who participate in a particular mission, as well as selecting from those available mission properties that you defined. So finally, you are now ready to export the survey package and go to the field to collect data. Woohoo! Exciting. And so here you can see observers taking careful distance measurements, and on the right, a photo of a great ape nest, clearly from our Congo survey. And when they went out in 2016-17, SmartER was still fairly new. And so they recorded the data both on the mobile devices and in notebooks as a backup option. So given the large extent of the area, so many missions were needed to complete the survey. In the middle, you can see an example screen you might have when selecting one of the sampling units, in this case, one of the transects that you're about to cover while in the field. And on the right, you can see the track logs showing the routes the survey teams took to complete part of the survey. And here is an example screen of some example screens of how things look when you observe an elephant dung pile and you want to record the relevant data. So each time a mission is completed and the field team returns, the data are imported into the main SmartYR system from the mobile devices. And there's several options available for how this can be done. You would import the data for an entire mission at once. And generally you start by importing your tracks. And this usually involves some editing using the track editor to manipulate the track data, because you need to chop it up into pieces sometimes, get rid of some pieces, and other pieces you want to make sure that they correspond correctly to the sampling units you defined as part of your original survey design. And sometimes, I don't know, you'll have pieces that are of effort that are associated with just GPS error, so you want to clean that up. You can do that either to some extent outside of SmartYR using other tools, or you can do it within Smart. And then you also need to tell Smart how to match your field data to the sampling units that are part of your survey design. So if during mission 1 you covered transects 1 to 10, then you need to take your track log, chop it into those pieces of transects 1 to 10, and associated the data correctly within Smart. So here's an example of importing data for the Congo survey. And what's very helpful is that you can see the data on a map like this one, or in tabular form. And then when you import the waypoints or observations, you also have different, again, import options available to you. And once again, you have to match the field data attributes to those attributes you defined earlier as part of your survey. And as you go through this process of validation and data import, you get a good chance to look at the data carefully and check it as you enter it into Smart. And here again, an example from the Congo observations on a map, which you can imagine makes sort of data validation a bit easier. So if you've previously used Smart for law enforcement monitoring, then you'll notice that the procedures for entering data from ecological surveys are pretty similar, except that you have choices whether to use a configurable or default data model. And as I mentioned before, the former allows for more efficient data entry. So once the data have been imported, then you can move on to some survey queries. In fact, you can use these queries as part of the data validation process, which is pretty handy. And there are several options to choose from in terms of survey queries. So for example, you might want survey observations. So show me where all my elephant dung piles were, or where all my great ape nests were found during the survey. So you can sort of put together different filters like that in fairly complicated queries. You can basically have a query of survey incidents, those that you've flagged in a particular way as an incident. And this very much sort of echoes the law enforcement monitoring way of doing things. And then for any particular sort of mission, you can look at the tracks involved in that mission, or you can set up queries around the missions themselves. And then you get also options for overall summary queries to like get a summary across your entire survey. And one that's also very handy is a spatial query that basically allows you to visualize your data across a survey grid. And again, you'll be able to see the results of queries either in a table or on a map. And here is a Congo example showing the results of a query to find the locations of illegal hunting camps. So although it was an ecological survey, they also recorded quite a few categories of human sign, and this was one of those categories. So a final feature available within SMART is the option to create reports. And this is particularly handy if you need to produce regular reports with some basic ecological survey data summaries. So basically you can tie the reports to a variety of queries, and then if you update your survey data on a regular basis, so maybe it's a survey that you complete every month or every 6 months, then you can you can basically generate a new report once you've entered the new round of survey data, which is very nice. But for more complicated and comprehensive analyses, you need to export the data from SMART into whichever analysis software is needed for your particular survey data. So for the Congo data, this required distance sampling analyses, either using the distance software or the distance R library. And fortunately, for those of us who do a lot with distance sampling data, there's now an extra output option available that allows one to export the data in a more streamlined fashion for a distance sampling analysis, which is super handy. So that was a tour of SMART-ER at high speed. And I hope I've shown you that how handy a tool it can be for standardized data collection, validation, storage, and retrieval. And that ideally this revolution in the technology that's now available for the collection and management of ecological survey data will go hand in hand with informative monitoring frameworks linked to appropriate survey methods with good survey designs and rigorous statistical analyses. Thank you. That's all I have for the moment.